So, welcome everybody to this event of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, the Green Political Foundation from Germany. And today's US briefing is dealing with Trump's rapid-fire dismantling of US democracy. And I'm very happy to welcome all of you as president of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, based in Berlin. And I'm also very happy to welcome my dear colleagues from our Washington, D.C. office, Hannah Winnick and Teresa Eder. And I'm happily inviting them to also come to the floor on this today's event. I will talk with both of them about the situation in the US with the new administration now in place. The Trump administration has entered offices with kind of a bang. Some would say this is some kind of a coup d'etat happening. We all were a lot surprised about the chaos, but also the speed of events happening from different angles, not only with the president himself, or just now at the Munich Security Conference with his Vice President J.D. Vance entering the stage in Europe, lecturing Europe about its inner status, but also with an actor like Elon Musk, the most rich person in the world right now, who has now taken also a post in the US administration in order to somehow disrupt the public institutions. That's what he's doing in the first days. And so there is a lot to talk about with Hannah and Teresa. And I will start with Hannah, who is our director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation since 2022. And the office is working in the US, but also in Canada with programs. And Hannah will answer my questions on the internal situation in the USA with the new government. And then after that, I will talk to Teresa, who is our expert as the program head for foreign and security policy in the DC office. And I'm very happy to also shed the light on the impacts of the new administration on the foreign and security policy area. So starting with you, Hannah, first of all, great to have you. Thanks for setting up this very important meeting.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
So looking at the first days of this year, I have to say I was following the events happening around like the inauguration end of January and the weeks after. But most people in Germany and Europe weren't really taking note in real time, as many things were developing so quickly. But you've been following that right from the beginning. And I think, first of all, we need maybe to catch up. What's actually happening, what happened. So make some sense of the slew of executive actions which we saw in the first weeks. What's the goal behind all of this, Hannah?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, first of all, Jan, I'll just say we have also been following the Munich Security Conference. And even though, of course, I think we're going to start with the domestic implications, and that's a good place to start. Just for our European audience, I want you to know it's making headlines here in the US too. And I think there's a really acute awareness that this administration is out not just to dismantle democracy here in the US, but really with an agenda to do that globally. And that's, I think, happening at a pace that is really hard to keep up with for everyone. Jan, if I can maybe take one step back from your question, because the question that I think we have been grappling with as we try to make sense of just how much is happening is who is actually doing these things. And that is really, really difficult to map because what's happened is you have, of course, Trump, and Trump is this erratic, strongman figure that I think we are familiar with from the first term, and his goals have not really changed. He's out to enrich himself and the billionaires around him. He's trying to make sure that he has impunity from the law. He's seeking retribution, and you've seen that, already with the people he's going after. And he has this fixation on tariffs and the trade deficit. That's the same as last time. I think what's interesting to see is the extent to which Trump has become a vehicle for all kinds of other right-wing interests and agendas, and that has taken on a speed and a life of its own that is different from the first administration. So looking maybe at the coalition, what I'm calling sort of the original MAGA coalition that we expected, that we prepared for. And this is the one that we saw, for example, all the dozens of voices that contributed to Project 2025. I think it's important to understand that it's not just one group. You have your Christian nationalists. That's people like Russell Vought, who's now in charge of the Office of Management and Budget. They're focused on rolling back women's rights, on rolling back LGBT rights, expanding the influence of religion, promoting a pro-life agenda. You have your nativists, your anti-immigrant fanatics like Stephen Miller. You want to make America white, deport as many immigrants as possible. And you have your America Firsters, who I think are maybe best embodied by someone like Vance, who are hyper-focused on this white working class identity, bringing manufacturing back. And then you add to that sort of toxic stew of right-wing ideologies, your corporate interests, most of all the fossil fuel interests that are attacking the climate agenda, and then a few former neoconservative Republicans like Mark Rubio and Mike Waltz, who are still really focused on China. And that's the original MAGA coalition. That's the right-wing agenda that we expected. What's completely new, and I mean, Jan, you're following this, of course, with your background in digital policy, is Musk and the tech billionaires, and the completely different agenda that they're bringing, which is just to disrupt everything and to burn it all down. And so I think that's the important place to start, is to know we have these three camps. We have Trump, we have these right-wing ideological camps, and then we have this new player, which is the whole tech world.
Right, that's already a lot to digest. We haven't even really gone through the impacts of all of what has happened, and I would be very happy to ask you again to maybe go into the details of what these three groups have proposed. And I guess there will be still a lot of questions. So for the audience, I'd just like to mention that there is the Q&A option, which you will find down in the menu. And you can already now put in questions for later after Hannah and Teresa have put forward their inputs to my questions. So again, Hannah, maybe elaborate a little bit deeper, like what can you see already from these three groups in effect?
Yeah. I think the way that I have been trying to make sense of it, and I mean, Jan, I'll be transparent, we're 1 month in. Our team is also really trying to just figure out how to keep track of everything that's happening. And I think the important thing is you can't get lost in every single executive order. We're trying to understand at a bigger picture strategically what's the goal. I see two visions. The original MAGA camp has a constructive vision. And what I mean by that is they are trying to build a powerful right-wing government. They are trying to engineer a right-wing takeover of the US government. And that is building on a decades-long strategy of the right to expand executive power. And you can see that within the executive branch. So if you think about the Department of Justice, all of the national security organizations, those are all part of the executive branch. They used to have some level of independence, which was really important to protect them from political influence. The goal of this right-wing movement is to eliminate any independence, to make everything a political project that is subject to the will of Donald Trump and the presidency. They want to eliminate the system of checks and balances, so that's extending executive power over Congress, over the Supreme Court. And they want to extend it nationally, which means you're building a powerful, I mean, at this point, I think it's fair to say authoritarian right-wing state that can also exert power over democratic states. And so you're seeing lawsuits against California, against New York. So that's the right-wing project, is to extend executive power. The tech project, it's totally different. And there are some points where they align, but there are a lot of points where they're in massive conflict. Musk is essentially pursuing sort of a disrupt it all, burn it down, eliminate everything. It's really the implementation of what we've seen in some of Silicon Valley's thinking, that what you really need is a CEO in charge of the federal government. And Musk is going at it exactly the way he did at Twitter, which is fire everyone, reduce wasteful spending. He's enriching himself in the process. I mean, there are already reports that Tesla's about to get a $400 million contract to build armored vehicles. He's hacked the government. I'm sure you've been reading about this, and they're literally training AI models on personal data that has become available. So the government is now his laboratory, and it's really questionable if there is any vision for what happens after that. So I think these are the two main competing visions. Maybe I'll just give one example, Jan, of where I think these clash, and that these are going to be the interesting moments that we will see in the future. The vision that the right-wing ideological movements had for USAID was to make this an instrument to expand right-wing ideologies globally. So to promote a fossil fuel agenda, to promote a pro-life agenda. They wanted to take that over ideologically. Musk has just eliminated it. So, I mean, for Musk, yes, he's shown that the presidency can do this, that they have the power. I mean, we'll see what the courts say, but he's also taken that tool out of the presidential toolkit.
Right. So, I mean, what we see is what you say is the coalition of three, like populism, Trump populism, the right-wing conservatives of the MAGA camp, and the libertarian, ultra-libertarian dismantlers or disruptors from Musk camp. Is there any way how we can see plans or activities by this coalition to be stopped or slowed down in Congress or in courts, as also, of course, some states already start to also go to court? Uh, what can you see as possibilities to also get into the way of this?
Yeah, the courts are going to be really important, and you've seen a number of these actions are either under review or have already been blocked by the courts. I think the most effective responses that we have seen have been from attorney generals in the different states and from civil rights organizations like the ACLU. The problem, I think, is at least twofold. One is court cases are slow, and Musk has this tech, move fast and break things ideology. And so by the time the courts get around to, for example, deciding on the future of USAID, I mean, all of the partners internationally who can't survive more than a week without US funding, they're gone. People I know working for USAID are already moving back to the US. You can't just start up that entire infrastructure again. They're creating realities on the ground. They're destroying things at a pace where we won't be able to just start them up again. And the other thing is that they are very explicitly questioning the court's legitimate power to determine these things. And I mean, Vance and Trump have both, made public statements essentially saying we may just not obey what the courts tell us to do. And that's a really terrifying scenario, because that is then a constitutional crisis. I mean, we don't know what happens when a president just decides not to follow the orders of a court.
Yeah, which we can see already now, of course, that there is questionable activity and questionable decisions regarding the legality also of these decisions. So what we can see already now is a lot. I mean, also we will talk with Teresa about all the foreign policy announcements the president has already made before entering even office. But is this going to continue in the same way? What can we expect in the upcoming months? And also to already address the first question in the Q&A, how near will be these activities to the whole project 2025? Is there a planned agenda behind that, which we can see to be like worked out by the Trump administration?
Um, I mean, I think one open question is, will this coalition hold as we start to see these conflicts like USAID emerge? And I mean, my fear and my suspicion is there is a lot of incentive for everyone involved to continue this coalition, because so many interests are getting so much of what they want. They may have to compromise here and there. They may not get USAID, but you still have the State Department. There is very little incentive for people to leave this coalition. Trump has so much power accumulated at this point. And so I think it might be different than the first administration in that it might be, in some sense, a more stable government. I hope I'm wrong. But we'll see. I think Musk is the one actor who also, just from a personality perspective, might go rogue. But Musk is also one person who Trump can't afford to offend. He can't have Musk as an enemy. And so I think there too, there are incentives on both sides to continue working together in a way where we could very well continue to see this speed for at least a while. Um, in terms of what we expect to see next, yes, I think a lot of it will follow Project 2025. Although, again, we have this rogue player with Musk, and that part is just unpredictable in the sense that he's just trying to tear things down. We know that they are going to try to close the Department of Education, and that, has primarily domestic implications, but it has massive implications for students, for public schools, especially in low-income communities. We know there are going to be many more rounds of layoffs, and I mean, just here in DC, the federal government is the biggest employer. I mean, many of you know DC in the audience. It's like massive factory shutoffs here. If you go to any restaurant right now, you hear people talking about people losing jobs. It's unbelievable the instability it has created. We're preparing for a new travel ban. We know that deportations will scale up. The attacks on the media will continue. We are seeing Musk now having access to individuals' tax information at the IRS. So I think we will start to see the weaponization of these types of government databases to pursue individuals. And I think the most frightening question, and maybe this is something we can talk more about, Jan, in the Q&A, is, if we're really paying attention to the language that they're using, the language that Vance used at the Munich Security Conference in terms of the enemy within, I think there are real questions about the potential for political violence that we need to at least confront with open eyes without hopefully being too alarmist.
Thank you. I mean, this is really an issue we should continue to talk in the Q&A. That's a very good point. Thank you for the first insights, Hannah, to the situation in the US under this new administration. And we'll come back to you together with Teresa after I have invited her to also lay out the view on the foreign and security policy field. Teresa, you are also in our DC office since 2022, heading our program for foreign and security policy. And I mean, as we already mentioned, there is a lot which already came on the table even before Trump entered office. Think alone about the whole Greenland escalation and the Panama Canal, where we already saw a Danish prime minister getting active, ramping up security measures. Or also a Panama government already changing policies due to the threat by Donald Trump. And now the Munich Security Conference right yesterday and the day before with the speech of J.D. Vance, where right after there was Emmanuel Macron as the Council of the European Union president calling for an extraordinary European Council meeting to react to that. This seems to be far more than what we have seen in the first Trump administration and term, where, of course, still already Trump was leaving the Paris protocols or was already ramping up tariffs, which he's doing now. I would say a bit more on steroids. Is that some kind of the idea behind it, to just ramp it up even more than until his last term ended?
Yeah, I would, and thank you for inviting me. Yes, I would agree with that assessment. I think there is a new quality to Trump's foreign policy this time around, obviously, first and foremost, because he's only surrounded by loyalists. And even someone like Marco Rubio, who is now Secretary of State, has already shown that he is basically following Trump's orders. I will go a little bit more into what that means also for Europe later. But yes, it has a different quality. And I think the biggest change we've seen so far is sort of this more territorial, imperial agenda, even, I would say. And I think it's something that we should definitely take seriously. This is not just rhetorics, but Trump seems to have an appetite to now really expand US territory in different ways, obviously. So, I mean, he's talking about Greenland, talking about Panama, talking about Gaza, renaming the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf of America, and then, for example, punishing the AP, the Associated Press, because they still refuse to call it the Gulf of America now. So there is obviously a lot at play. I think what's important maybe to understand is also the different sort of groups, similar to what Hannah has described for the domestic context. In the foreign policy context, was what used to be the case in the first Trump administration was that there were still a lot of US primacists there, meaning people who think that the US should have a forward-looking, forward-leaning leadership role in the world to stabilize geopolitical order. And among those people were, for example, Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, and the likes. And I think we've seen a real shift away from that. I would even say there is a disdain of these primacists now in the Trump administration. And this time around, for example, the person who's overseeing these foreign policy appointments is Don Jr., and it's not Jared Kushner anymore. And they are making a point in keeping these people out that have these this sort of foreign policy vision for America. And instead, what you have are, again, a sort of a mix of different people. Some of them are China hawks, obviously. Some of them are more isolationist and say, essentially in a European context, first and foremost, that, okay, America has no interest in Europe really anymore. There's no need to support Ukraine. We should focus on China, or we should focus on the Middle East because of our religion, because of basically Christian nationalism. I think that's an important point to make. So someone like J.D. Vance is not a pure isolationist. He's, for example, definitely arguing for a robust engagement in the Middle East, but it's not driven by any sort of geopolitical realist mindset, but it's because of his own religious views, and it's religiously motivated. So I think that's an interesting component that comes in here into foreign policy, and also shows you how intertwined and domestic policy at this point is of the Christian nationalists, of the evangelicals, with foreign policy. And maybe lastly, I would also say that, Trump himself has also been cast as an isolationist in the last term, because he seems to, not want to go to war, not to put troops on the ground. But I would actually say that's mischaracterizing him a little bit, because there are so many other tools how he can engage in the world. And right now he's engaging through, blackmailing, through tariffs. We can talk about the cyberspace, for example. So there's many different areas where Trump definitely is not an isolationist, but has very clear goals for America to be first, meaning to be an imperial power, and to basically, at least also with regards to Latin America, something we can also get into is we are already seeing that the US shows a lot more interest in its immediate neighborhood this time around in the Western Hemisphere than it did in the last couple of administrations. So there is a real, push to, to posture in the world much more than it was the first time around.
Yeah, I think that the picture of being an imperial power focused solely on the own interests of the US economy, and also these camps, religious camps and others, seems to fit very precisely on what happens, which is on the one side a withdrawal from all the international order and the classical infrastructure of the West, by withdrawing from United Nations. He's not even talking about it anymore as something of WTO, of NATO, and all institutionalized frameworks, and diverting this energy into like focused interaction by himself and his followers. And at the same time, dismantling thereby the institutions who were standing for this old kind of policymaking, like people working in the US Department of State or with USAID, which is obviously the biggest case now, where we can see how quickly he's just saying goodbye to this old order and also to the people who were standing for it. So let me ask you about that. How do you see that as an impact inside the US, but also outside? When we think about the huge role USAID, for example, is playing for almost everything in the international community.
Yeah, I think it's something, you know, that will affect really the whole world. This new sort of path for US foreign policy, if you will. I think in the case of USAID, Hannah spoke about the sort of more domestic impacts and obviously people losing their jobs, etc. But I mean, we are now in a world where there is no clear like monitoring of Ebola in Rwanda, for example, or patients not being able to get their medications in Africa, or a lot of women are deeply affected by this as well. No health and reproductive care or rights, because clinics are closing as we speak, and they cannot continue to operate without that money from the US. I think in addition to USAID, one thing that will be interesting to follow in the coming weeks and months is sort of how the US will continue or not continue to engage in multilateral institutions. You've already spoken about the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. The US also withdrew from the WHO because Trump was very much at loggerheads with the WHO during the COVID pandemic. And so, but there are a lot more institutions that we haven't seen how they react to it. Trump on February 4 actually passed an executive order to review every US engagement in multilateral institutions. And so we will see what comes of that. In some cases, it might be that the US really leaves the organizations. In some cases, it might be that the US contributes less than it has done in the past. And I think we also have to realize, the US in basically all of these organizations is the largest contributor. So for example, speaking about the World Bank, the US also has veto power. And the big question will be sort of, the critics of, and I'm one of them, of dismantling USAID have said, well, you are losing a lot of soft power by closing USAID. This was basically one of the best instruments for us to be seen favorably in the world by doing humanitarian assistance, etc. And the big question will be also with the World Bank and other multilateral institutions, if the US withdraws, who's going to step in? I mean, obviously China will step in. So, I mean, how does this feature in the US-China competition then? And so I think it's not like as clear cut for the US with certain multilateral institutions, but just to give you a brief example, there's also, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank here for Latin America here in the US, and the former president was ousted and fired because of corruption. He's now the special envoy for Latin America for Trump. So obviously he's also out for retribution and probably going to take revenge. So there's a lot of interpersonal things going on as well that will determine whether or not the US will stay in certain institutions. And so I think it is, important to follow those developments, and that will also really shift on a larger scale, the geopolitical order, because China will probably use this opportunity to gain influence in these fora, and the US, I mean, Trump is convinced that the US has been wronged in all these multilateral institutions. He has no he sees no value in them, essentially. But it could also come back to bite the US.
Yeah, maybe I'm just entering into the point of multilateral institutions right there, because that's a very important point you're making. That, of course, also the withdrawal from the WHO and other, like also the protocols, the others on the Paris Agreement and so on. So there's this complete withdrawal from the multilateral order. And at the same time, that's also addressed by a question here in the Q&A. We can see that the US, who were standing for multilateral order and democracies versus authoritarianism, is now more or less very near to authoritarian leaders like Milei in Argentina, or in general, also some people of the BRICS network. So how do we reassess our view on the role of the US in this multilateral geopolitical landscape? How can we locate this government, which at the same time is very hawkish on China? Yes, but that's not really for, it doesn't seem to be very much for human rights or democracy, but for like geopolitical security and economic interests. So how do we pinpoint this new US government in this fight between democracies and authoritarianism on a global scale? Before coming in the next question, maybe also on the role of the European Union.
Yeah, so I think we have to understand that Trump doesn't have a coherent foreign policy vision. He's not an ideologue, but I think where one could potentially say he's more of an ideologue is that he prefers working with autocrats over democratic leaders. He thinks that is easier to engage with them. He has, again, he sees no value really in allies. I mean, it's the fact that we're talking about annexing Canada, or putting tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which are the most important trading partners for the US, and who are supposed to be their longstanding friends and allies, is telling in itself that he really does not care. He does not care about these relations. And I think with regards to autocrats, and especially China, yes, sure, there's still a US-China competition, but I could potentially really see that this is more like, a spheres of influence policy. So Trump will be okay with China wielding its influence in the Asia Pacific, but obviously basically the US is then in charge of the Western Hemisphere. That's one thing that will be also interesting to see how it plays out, with especially countries like Panama, where he, the main argument for getting the Panama Canal back is because China has two important ports there, and obviously the US has a lot of levers to pressure and push these countries to expel China. So I think there is, I think we'll be more in a world where there are spheres of influence, and obviously the fact that Elon Musk has so many investments in China is also something that can be sort of a hurdle or an obstacle for Trump to really go hard on China, because the Chinese have leverage there too. So if there are higher tariffs, they could very well target Tesla in China, etc. So it's not as clear cut or easy as it was before the election, where really the one thing where everybody in town really agreed on, whether it was Democrats or Republicans, was that China was the biggest competitor and rival for the US. And I feel like now we are steering a little bit away from that because of Elon Musk's influence. But I think it's also an area where we still have to wait and see. It's not, that we've seen a clear-cut China policy yet from the Trump administration. I just saw yesterday that the State Department actually deleted a small sentence from their website on Taiwan where they were arguing that, before it said that Taiwan is not an independent country, and they deleted that as a sign to potentially as a sign or a symbol to the Chinese. So it's, again, this is a very muddy area, and we will see which way Trump goes and who he'll be influenced more by Musk, someone like Musk, or is it more people like Waltz or Rubio?
Right. Before now getting into answering or asking more questions to Hannah and you together, Teresa, I would like to ask you one thing. And that's maybe also a big thing. So you were talking about the leverage the Chinese have vis-a-vis Trump. Those who have no leverage at all right now, obviously, seems to be the Europeans. So who were hit or are hit in a moment of lacking leadership, lacking capacities to act. As in Berlin and Paris, there is no real government in place. In both countries, we have to see how these things evolve. We have other actors like the Netherlands or Austria who are in delicate moments. We have two stability factors, which is the European Commission, but that's still arriving. And the Polish government, which seems to be a little bit strange, but heading now the presidency of the European Council, so of the Council of the European Union, to be honest. And so this is a very delicate moment for the Europeans. And we can see with this Munich Security Conference how vulnerable obviously Europe is. Macron is now calling for this summit on Ukraine. We have seen the Trump administration, together with the tech billionaires, as Hannah has mentioned, are now using foreign and security leverage to hinder the Europeans following their strong regulatory approach on the biggest market they represent. So this is becoming more and more problematic for the Europeans. How do the Europeans get out of this moment in light of the geopolitical mess you were just lining out? So is there any window for the Europeans to get out of this?
Well, I would say, it's going to be very tough and not an easy thing for the Europeans to do. That's very clear. But I think what is important to actually move in the same direction is to really understand what has happened in Munich with JD Vance. This is not, this was not just rhetorics. This was not just a speech to scare the Europeans. I think they are really serious about, leaving the Europeans alone. Essentially, and then in addition to that, I mean, the speech of Vance was essentially meddling in European affairs and pushing or basically gaslighting the Europeans and saying you are not a democracy because you have regulations and there's no free speech in Europe, etc. You're calling off your elections, etc. I mean, that was a gaslighting move par excellence. It's like I'm still. I still think it's to a certain degree unbelievable that he went to Munich and did that. But I think it's important to understand what I've said earlier, that the US foreign policy really has moved away from Europe. They don't see any value in the transatlantic alliance. They are a power in Europe, but not a European power, where they are also invested in the European project, in the EU. They are obviously their policy is transactional, but with that regards, like a week ago, you still heard, how many Europeans want to offer to buy more US weapons, etc., to get the US on their side. And I think maybe this is one of my most important points here. I think it is of great importance for the Europeans to understand that they really need to shift away from the US and to think about how to de-risk from the US instead of becoming even more intertwined and dependent on the US. Because if the Europeans decide to now say, again, buy more weapons from the US, get more LNG from the US, etc., I mean, it's not gonna, the transatlantic relationship is not suddenly gonna bloom because of that. It's just gonna be the next step for Trump to blackmail the Europeans even more. So I think it is really important that the Europeans are coming together on this one, and follow the same, policy, and come up with a plan too, with a strategy. And I think this is something that we've seen in the last years, and you mentioned the lack of leadership, is like there needs to be a proactive stance and plan and strategy in place. You cannot, for example, I just saw the headline from today, Olaf Scholz saying like, yeah, it's too early to talk about European troops in Ukraine. No, it's not too early. It's too late. It's like we have to get into action right now and really come together as Europeans, to figure out how we can, best navigate this. And the thing is, like, I'm fully aware of the trade-offs. I'm fully aware of that there are many trade-offs, and that the Europeans can't just say, okay, we're not dependent on US weapons anymore tomorrow, but they should at least have something in place where they can move away, and make sure that the dependencies are less on the US than it used to be. And also with regards to regulation and big tech, something that we also have to keep in mind, the US administration will use different levers in different scenarios. So like, we've already kind of seen a little bit of that with, I think, the speech at the AI summit, where again, the US might very well use the the tariffs against Europe because Europe wants to enforce its regulation for the Digital Services Act. So they are thinking like that. It's not just one. Ukraine is one thing.
No, they're putting it together.
That regulation, it's like all intertwined. Yeah,
absolutely, and that's obviously like this. This approach of trying to like get transactional deals on everything, which Trump is following in all these policy fields together at the same time. I'd like to invite Hannah back to our podium and ask you both, maybe starting with Hannah, some follow-up questions to that. There's been the question also in the Q&A about how can we predict also with regards to Ukraine and NATO, the foreign policy of Trump, following to the question I put to Teresa right now on what can the Europeans do. Of course, they need to predict this. At the same time, Teresa says Europe needs to become independent. At the same time, there is no budget in Berlin, in Paris, and nor is it in Brussels on the EU level. So it seems to be a very problematic moment to really like anticipate what the Europeans can and need to do next. Do you see anything where you would say this would be the most important step for the Europeans, and they can or they should prepare for this next step in the 2025 program on NATO? Or how do you assess this situation of the Europeans?
I mean, going to the question, right? I think the question was how closely does the policy that we've seen on NATO so far track with Project 2025? And it's one of the areas where I think we can see Musk's influence and sort of this X factor, because when you look at what they wrote that they were planning in 2025, it was fairly traditional. It was what, the embassies here in DC were preparing for. It was an increase in burden sharing, going at least to the 2%, but most likely far above that, moving sort of the US focus toward Asia. So all of that Europe was prepared for. That's what people were prepared to talk about at the Munich Security Conference. And that's obviously not what's happened. And I think the X factor has, at least in considerable part, been Musk with his interference in the German elections, making this foray to the AfD and opening up sort of a new flank in how the administration is approaching Europe. And Vance, as sort of the bridge between the tech bros and this right-wing ideology, is happy to follow that course. And Trump seems to be giving them free rein. So my sense is that is the direction they're taking it in. If they're full steam ahead on sort of this ideological anti-democratic strategy, that is what I would continue to expect, and that means there needs to be a two-pronged strategy. One needs to be really finally understanding that the attack on Ukraine is an attack on Europe. And that means, like Teresa said, you need to put military power behind that. It's not enough to just send money. And I think that's finally starting to come across, and it will have a cost, of course, for Europe. But the other one is the attack on democracies within Europe. And I don't think we've done enough to strengthen and make our own elections, our own democracies really resilient to what could come when you have someone with Musk and his platforms, when you have a US government and Russia and China all trying to meddle in your elections.
Yeah, I mean, this maybe also following to that, there's Helga Schmidt who asked the question about the like new vocabulary Vance is bringing up in Munich regarding like the religious groups you mentioned, and this and asked about is this a facade or is this really like their program? And is this also what we can see at other occasions, as she was referencing here, that Access first appearance in Brussels at NATO HQ is going into this a similar direction. So how do we deal with this new kind of agenda?
It's confusing because, of course, Trump is not a religious person, could care less about these interests, and there are certainly other actors in this wide coalition who, like him, don't particularly care. But I mean, again, and this is why I find this mapping so helpful, you have a really powerful base of voters in the evangelicals and in this Christian nationalist movement that cares and for whom this is the issue. And I think Vance legitimately is part of that. You see it, I mean, domestically in the agendas they're pushing in public schools and in reproductive rights, but internationally, I think where you've seen it, Teresa mentioned this before, where you've seen it most prominently has been in the Christian Zionist agenda that's pushed in the Middle East. That is the driving agenda behind Israel policy for the US. And I think it's important also for a German context to understand the differences in motivations in what is driving these administrations to engage in that region. So I would advise us to take it seriously, even if it doesn't mean, that each actor who's speaking on it necessarily believes what they're saying.
Right. Before getting to Teresa once again with maybe two aspects on foreign and security policy, I'd like to just ask you, Hannah, another question, which I also think is very important, as we can see that the Munich appearance of Vance also was received in the US by messages like Scholz rebuking, or also Steinmeier and others like reacting to this appearance. That's one kind of effect this all has back in the US, of course, on the people there. Another one, even more concrete, is the question of rising prices again in light of the tariffs, which might now change the whole economic situation vis-a-vis Mexico and Canada in particular. So do you see that there will be negative effects for the population in the US by these policies and measures? And could that lead to some kind of erosion of public support?
There will be negative effects. I mean, for sure from the tariffs, I think all economists are preparing for sort of a rise in inflation. We're seeing already Trump trying to interfere with Fed policy. He wants them to lower interest rates, even though, of course, they're anticipating prices will be rising with these tariffs. The job layoffs, it's not just the federal jobs, it's all of the contractors. There are ripple effects with this. USAID buys food from American farmers to deliver internationally. So the ripple effects are going to start to be felt very acutely. If we have mass deportations, that's our agriculture sector, that's our construction sector. So we will see these things hit. I think the thing that scares me, especially looking at, our experience under COVID, is who is shaping the information environment that helps people make sense of what they're experiencing and figure out where to lay the blame. And for Trump's base, that is Fox News, that is X, that is Meta. And what we saw, I mean, there's this interesting anecdote I was reading over the weekend that said in the most Republican areas, the death rate from COVID was 2.5 times higher than in the most Democratic areas because people refused to be vaccinated. That didn't affect their vote. I mean, they were literally willing to die and willing to risk their life because of what they believed ideologically. So I don't want to paint this too black and white. There will be people who will be affected and who will, change their view on Trump. The question, I mean, one is, will that be enough of the base? And two is, how much of a democratic system are we going to have left in 4 years for that to really then translate into a voting result?
That leads me to a question which I would put towards you, Hannah, at the end, to also look a little bit on the outlook for what could be a democratic world after this Trump term. But Teresa, I'd like to just ask you once more on foreign policy. You mentioned, for example, the Gaza proposal by Trump, which of course has has proposed some or provoked some reactions, saying that this is really not serious. But like looking on these activities, it's hard to sometimes assess what's meant serious and what not. We have all learned that we have to take autocrats very serious and what they say in detail, not only with Trump, but also with Putin and others. It's obvious that they say what they want to do. So looking at those interactions in the world, do you see that this US administration will try to, by all like isolation tendencies, still have influence on like negotiations now we see with Ukraine again or with Middle East, that they will take that in on their plate? And if yes, if they do so, will they do it together with the Europeans or together with the international community, or will it be really rather transactional with certain players like Saudi Arabia or with Putin directly, as we can see right now? Obviously being the direction that he's taking.
Yeah, I think it's, for example, telling that they choose to negotiate in Saudi Arabia, of all places, with Putin, and that Zelensky has to basically ask Trump to include the Europeans, should also tell you the importance that Europe plays in his sort of thinking. I think it's obviously hard to predict what will happen with Ukraine and Russia, but my sort of guiding line as to assess is always, is Trump gonna look good after it or not? And if Trump thinks that Putin and Zelensky can come to an agreement that makes him look good, not necessarily Zelensky or Putin, then he might move forward with it. And I think it's also remarkable, we saw the ceasefire in Gaza right before his inauguration. That is not a coincidence. And it is sort of a common talking point from all the foreign policy advisors and people in the Trump universe to say that, in the first term, there were no wars, there was nothing happened. It was stable, and it was because of our strength that we showed, and people were scared of us. Maybe one last thing, I think someone who really understands how Trump works is actually Zelensky, so it might work in his favor. And I thought it was remarkable that he mentioned in Munich that he told Trump that Putin is scared of him. This is how you can work with Trump. You have to, it's all personal. You have to tell him how awesome he is. And I think, obviously this can also go hugely wrong this time around. We are in a different world now, and there's so many factors and so many, crises already ongoing and challenges. And one thing that I, for example, haven't even mentioned yet is also, again, Elon Musk basically calling into question whether the US is a reliable partner on intelligence. Because now he and his, group of people that are working for him have access to all those top secret information when they shouldn't, because you have to go through a clearance process before that normally. And there are certain rules and just there's so many checks and balances in place in the US government itself that have and norms that have been broken from someone like Musk and his people, that really the question is, can you trust even US intelligence at this point? So a lot of these factors will be felt probably in the long run, and can also be exploited obviously by US adversaries like China and Russia. I mean, all the statements that have come out of the Trump administration this past week in Munich, they have been very favorable to Russia. And I think there is a lot of alignment on, for example, again, going back to this Christian nationalist piece, the view of, the family, alignment in anti-gender policy, etc.
They unfortunately seem to share some ideologies. I absolutely agree to that. That brings me back, Hannah, to my final question, which I think also is really important, and it takes on board the question by Niklas Peters, who's asking about the Democrats who still are there in the country, and I don't mean only the party, but also the question: are there democratic actors who could win back trust from manual workers and others in smaller cities and in the South, and could be a hope, persons who could be hopeful, reference points also for the time after Trump. Although we all have to say, of course, the question, what's left of democracy after this Trump term, is one question. And the other question is, if it's maybe not even any more Trump at the end of this term who's in office, and if there's someone like the vice president who could run for a next term. So how do we get out of that also in the US? Is there a hope where we can look at during the upcoming 3 years, 3.5?
I know we're trying really hard to end on a hopeful note. I'll try. I mean, I'll say this: the Democratic Party is not in a good place. They are really lost. And they are being flooded by calls from the base. And what you hear from Democrats is complaining. What do you want us to do? Call the Republicans, literally, is what some of them are saying. That said, I think Hakeem Jeffries is starting to realize that, this is a different historical moment. It's not enough to say we're in the minority, we don't have any power. They need to be more creative about moments where they do have leverage. And so you're starting to see the Democrats now put together a rapid response task force with a 10-point plan. And I mean, I hope it's a good one, but they're focusing at least on, moments like the vote in the middle of March over the government shutdown. What can they get out of that negotiation if the Republicans need them? Can they at least, push through keeping some of the federal programs funded? In terms of the bigger question, I have a lot of trust in civil society, and I think the energy that you see from people calling Democrats, you're seeing protests, organized in LA, in San Francisco, in Seattle. You've seen protests in front of the federal buildings. I think there's a willingness and an awareness that people need to speak out and need to speak out early. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see more of that. I think what Niklas asked, the question of sort of who is the voice, who is the leadership, is really, it is the question that we're all asking right now. And I think the challenge is there is no, there is no leader, there is no Messiah figure who's emerging. And so I think what we're going to have to see is a more decentralized resistance movement, where it's really civil rights organizations that are coming together, where it's grassroots organizations that are coming together. I have a lot of hope in the power of the federal system, of the democratic states to resist. Because they have, they have their own budgets. I mean, California is essentially, the 7th largest economy in the world, or something at that scale. So I think there are these spaces where resistance can be organized and has the potential to make a difference. But it's a scary situation for people in the US right now. And I think it would be, naive to try to gloss over that. And I think what you see right now, I mean, just as an anecdote, I was starting to, look for a few books that I wanted to reread, from Hannah Arendt and, Rebecca Solnit on organizing and totalitarianism, and they're all on back order in every bookstore. So people are looking for answers, and I think also, realizing that this is a moment where we are looking to history to understand how this has unfolded in other places.
Absolutely. That's on point. Exactly the message which has to be understood. And obviously, as well as in the US, as here in Europe, people are going to understand it now. And it is necessary that we understand if we want to search for answers in the upcoming time. We will be searching for those answers in further occasions. And for this moment, I'd like to thank you very much, Hannah Winnick and Teresa Ida from our Washington, D.C. office. And I thank you all for following us with our analysis, which will still be coming. So thank you for all of you for participating today, and see you on the next occasion with the Böll Foundation.